Well, welcome you all. So I'm Brad Lovelace, and I want to welcome you to the WAFWA CCAA webinar. This is our attempt to update you all on our progress and background, plus recent progress when it comes to administering the CCAA. And I am Brad Lovelace. I'm the Secretary of Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks, and I'm currently the chair of WAFWA's Lesser Prairie-Chicken Initiative Council. And I'd like to introduce a few of our important guests and participants. First, Zach Lowe is with us today. He is the brand new Executive Director for WAFWA. And so we're welcoming Zach. Good to see you, Zach. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Salakis. Jennifer is from British Columbia, and she is the current WAFWA president. And Jen's work for British Columbia is she's in the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations. She is a Director of Wildlife and Habitat. So welcome, Jen. All right, then I would like to introduce our speakers very briefly, and you'll hear obviously more from them later. But we have Chris Moore, who is the interim executive director of WAFWA before Zach came on, and he currently is WAFWA's executive support person. Then Chanda Petty, who you see in the first screen, is our Lesser Prairie-Chicken program manager for WAFWA. And you'll hear more from Chanda also. Then Kent Fricke is our small game coordinator for wildlife parks here in Kansas. And he's also the WAFWA's Lesser Prairie-Chicken Interstate Working Group chair. And prior to Sunday, he was a bachelor, and now he's Mr. Married Kent Fricke. So congratulations, Kent. And lastly, I'll introduce Ben Guion. Ben is the CEO of Conservation Investment and Management. And for WAFWA, he's our Lesser Prairie-Chicken Business Strategy Consultant. And so good to see you, Ben. All right, so our goal today, as I said before, is to get people up to speed on what's going on with this Lesser Prairie-Chicken program, our CCAA, and our goal is really to pass on as much information as we can to you in the 2 hours that we have. Our presentations are arranged in 2 panels that will talk about a chronological recap of our involvement with Lesser Prairie-Chickens. And then secondly, another panel that will give you a more extensive update on where the program is going and how we plan to move forward with the CCAA. At the end of our time, we will open things up for questions, but you will be muted during the presentation. If you want to submit questions, please submit those in the chat directly to Chanda. She will be looking for your questions. She'll be compiling those, and then we'll pull those out at the end, share those with everybody, and figure out which person on our panel is most appropriate to answer those. So it'll be kind of a team effort to get through those. So please, again, submit your questions via the chat function directly to Chanda. She'll compile those, and then we'll get to those as the last step in today's webinar. We also will be recording this webinar, and we're glad to share that with you. It may take a day or two for us to get all that compiled, but we will be glad to share that with you, and you can look to WAFWA's website to find that here in the next couple days. So with that, I would ask my presenters if there's anything I missed before we go on to the next step. Okay, nobody's yelling at me, so that's a good sign. Okay, well then that gets us to our first portion, which is range-wide oil and gas CCAA for Lesser Prairie-Chickens. And we'll start off with Kent Fricke, our own small game coordinator here from Kansas. And he's going to give you background on 7 years of implementing Lesser Prairie-Chicken conservation. Kent.
Thank you very much, Brad, and appreciate everybody's attendance here today. As I move some things here on my screen after the screen share, you should now be seeing my presentation. And I wanted to just briefly go over what has happened since the range-wide plan was finished in late 2013 and the oil and gas CCAA that Brad mentioned was put in place was approved in February of 2014. So as Brad mentioned, the last 7 years of what we've been doing in Lesser Prairie-Chicken conservation. As Brad mentioned, I'm currently the chair of the Lesser Prairie-Chicken Interstate Working Group, which is a 5-member working group within WAFWA that is composed of the 5 state wildlife biologists who are working on lesser prairie chickens in each of our respective states. So I'm here as a representation of that group here today. So very briefly, of course, the lesser prairie chicken is iconic grouse species found in the southern Great Plains. Grassland obligate, lecking species. They have a very intricate, very neat to see lecking ritual that they do every spring on what they would and where they accumulate on lecks, but numbered in the hundreds of thousands of birds historically. However, we've certainly seen a significant reduction in both the population and the habitat that they're associated with throughout the southern Great Plains. As much as 90% of the species habitat is diminished across their historical range. And in response to that, what we're going to dive into today is how WAFWA and the Lesser Prairie-Chicken Interstate Working Group embarked on a really unique opportunity to develop a range-wide conservation plan for this species. Very innovative and unprecedented in terms of what has been done previous to this with a grassland obligate species with such a large ranging species as well. Again, very briefly, a little bit of timeline context for kind of how the Fish and Wildlife Service has approached this species as well from an Endangered Species Act and regulatory standpoint. The Lesser prairie chicken as a species was first proposed as a candidate species back in 1998. In 2008, the priority level was elevated within the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then in 2010 and into 2011, there were numerous lawsuits and settlement agreements between the Fish and Wildlife Service and environmental organizations wanting to see some action taken with not only the lesser prairie chicken, but a number of species that were on the endangered species or on the candidate species list, but no action had been taken in quite some time. So from the 2010, because of that elevated priority level and ensuing lawsuits and settlement agreements, from 2011 to 2013, the Lesser Prairie-Chicken Interstate Working Group was tasked from our wildlife directors to develop a range-wide conservation plan with the specific purpose of trying to get in front of a listing, provide specific information to help inform any potential listing decisions, and really just get everybody on the same page when it comes to range-wide conservation of the species. And again, this was an effort that was within WAFWA, but included the state wildlife directors, significant impacts or inputs from industry, private landowners, and all of our conservation partners. And so again, lots of stakeholder involvement in this process. That culminated in a range-wide plan that was finalized in October 2013, range-wide conservation plan. And since then, in early 2014, the bird was listed as threatened by the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act. But then in 2015, that listing was vacated by a federal judge. And in June of 2016, the species actually came off the threatened species list. Then in September of 2016, the species was re-petitioned for listing. And in November of 2016, the Fish and Wildlife Service found that that petition was warranted. And so then began another process of developing a species status assessment and re-looking at the species. Then I think just moving forward to 2021, June 1st of 2021, the Fish and Wildlife Service formally proposed listing the species as two distinct population segments, with the northern population segment being proposed as threatened, and the southern distinct population being proposed as endangered. So, with that very brief background, as I mentioned, in 2013, the Lesser Prairie-Chicken Interstate Working Group, in collaboration with a number of our partners, finalized the Lesser Prairie-Chicken range-wide conservation plan. And again, this was a very strategic, collaborative approach that tries to focus efforts within the area, conservation effort within the areas that we feel are the highest priority for lesser prairie chickens to be sustained into the future, and also helps us target industry developments and negative impacts to the species in other portions of the range where it's not as critical for the species. And again, this overall document is meant to be extremely comprehensive to both the species biology and recognition of the various impacts that are out there on the landscape. And so looking more directly into the range-wide plan itself, the plan was endorsed by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2013 and included some very specific aspects that are extremely important to conserving the species into the future. First, it identified both population and habitat goals at the range-wide scales and within each of the ecoregions. It describes the desired habitat amount for a number of acres throughout the range, as well as what ideal habitat conditions look like on the ground at a very small scale. Extremely importantly, the range-wide plan developed a decision support tool. Many of you will recognize this as the CHAT, the Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool. But more specifically to the range-wide plan itself, it importantly describes focal areas and connectivity zones where the Interstate Working Group and our partners, when developing the range-wide plan, felt that it was extremely important to conserve and enhance the most habitat within those areas, and then develop metrics by way to follow that through time and determine what the successes and failures are that we have through time and modify as needed accordingly. It took efforts to expand voluntary conservation. We'll talk about one example today in terms of the oil and gas CCAA that's administered by WAFWA, but identifies a number of other areas and opportunities for conservation organizations, landowners, and industry to look at ways to do voluntary conservation on the landscape. As part of that, as I mentioned, there's agreements to avoid and minimize impacts from negative impacts. And then there are also components to the range-wide plan also set up a very unique and important mitigation framework to offset those impacts. Additionally, the range-wide plan identifies research priorities that has helped guide research, and even since then, in 2016, a very important comprehensive Lesser Prairie-Chicken book has been published based on some of the outputs from the range-wide plan in 2013. And then it also looks at how we can monitor both vegetation and populations starting in 2012 with the aerial surveys and other mechanisms for monitoring conditions and populations so that we can track how these birds are doing through time. It very importantly and explicitly identifies an adaptive management framework for everybody to have input into the range-wide plan and how that needs to adjust through time based on the metrics that have already been identified. And it continues stakeholder input into this process. We have a Lesser Prairie-Chicken Initiative Council that's made up of the state directors in the 5 states. We have an advisory committee that advises the council on opportunities for changes to the range-wide plan. And within even the advisory committee, we have both a science subcommittee and a fee structure committee to provide those additional information into that. We also have the Interstate Working Group and through all of these mechanisms, we have the ability to continue this stakeholder input into the range-wide plan. Now, for the purposes of today's webinar, we're really going to focus specifically on the mitigation framework aspects of the range-wide plan and how that is used to offset impacts. And so this is the mitigation framework entails a two-pronged strategy with encompassing both species conservation and an acknowledgement and recognition that we're trying to allow industry activities to continue within the Lesser Prairie-Chicken range. And so on the species conservation side, it is meant to encourage incentive-based conservation. It helps coordinate all programs. And so the range-wide plan itself, by spatially detailing where we feel the most important areas for conservation targeting are, it allows CRP with FSA, programs with NRCS, individual programs through something like the Nature Conservancy, and a number of other examples to coordinate where their conservation efforts are going in on the ground to best benefit the species. It identifies a common approach and tools to help in the approach of this, and then encourages impacts to avoid and minimize where those important areas are. And then on the industry activity side of things, it provides a framework in order to look at how those impacts are offset. And then importantly, encourages again how and identifies ways to avoid and minimize those impacts on the landscape. And so specifically today, we're going to be talking about the Lesser Prairie-Chicken range-wide oil and gas CCAA. And again, CCAA is the acronym here. This is a conservation candidate conservation agreement with assurances that is an approved document with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so this is the document that we'll be talking about today. And so in general, CCAAs are collaborative efforts that are approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service and provide assurances to the participants within them that they'll have regulatory assurances into the future of in case the bird gets listed under the Endangered Species Act and how the potential impacts of that listing will or will not impact those industries and participants that are signed up within a CCAA agreement. These are voluntary agreements that companies can enter into, but importantly, from a conservation standpoint, it's a biologically based framework that we've developed for this particular CCAA that incorporates both habitat quality and quantity to offset and determine how those offsets and improvements to habitat are considered in this. And so these are really important aspects to keep in mind as we move through the discussion today. And overall, we've been extremely effective with the CCAA current to date. As again, this started in 2014 and has been running through ever since. And so again, this was designed to promote voluntary avoidance and minimization of impacts to lesser prairie chicken habitat. And to date, we've importantly had, one of the important aspects of this is that we've had 89% project co-location rates, meaning that impacts are clustered on the landscape as opposed to distributed at lower densities. It really helps to still allow industry activities to move forward, but if they're co-located with other previous impacts, that does equal less impact to the species. To date, there's been no direct species mortality that's been reported with the CCAA, the oil and gas CCAA that's administered by WAFWA, and projects are generally located in low quality habitat. And so for the CCAA, we utilize a habitat evaluation guide, what many on this webinar will refer to as the HEG. And basically this is an average, a habitat score for where projects are being located and how we measure the conservation sites that are being used to offset those impacts. And so as you see on the bottom right of this, this slide, the average habitat score or HEG score for projects that are enrolled in the CCAA is 0.28, which is relatively low on that habitat quality scale. But the conservation sites that are being utilized to offset those impacts have a relatively high habitat score of 0.71, with 1 being as ideal as it gets. I will note on the bottom left there underneath the maps that and you can see the distribution of where habitat has been enrolled, where acres have been enrolled into the program. And we've had 111 industry participants enroll in the WAFWA Oil and Gas CCAA, with more than 6.2 million acres enrolled in the program. And so this is just a general overview of what we've experienced during the last 7 years and the industry participation in the program. I also wanted to note on the right side that we've been very effective in the conservation that's been utilized in this program. To date, there's been just over 7,600 habitat acres that have been impacted by CCAA enrollments by industry, but that has been offset by over 99,000 habitat acres that have been conserved through this program. In addition, we are providing a net conservation benefit to the species, and as many who are participating in today's webinar will recognize, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the ICF report that came out last year both recommended utilizing a offset ratio of, if 1 acre of habitat is impacted, offsetting that with at least 1 acre of restoration, in addition to at least 1 acre of enhancement. And so again, at the top of that slide, you see that 7,600 acres have been impacted. That to date, that has been offset by more than 17,000 acres of restoration and more than 83,000 acres of enhancement. And so I think we're really doing a really good job on that front. Additionally, hopefully many have seen the latest aerial survey results that we've come out with and have been posted to the WAFWA website. What we did, we reported there in that report this year, the rolling 3-year range-wide average population size as well, which you'll find in the appendices to that report. And you'll see that we have documented that increase in prairie chicken populations, and since the severe droughts of 2011, 2012 that really impacted the southern Great Plains. And we continue to monitor that population through time. There we go, sorry. And then, so that's where I'll wrap up for this portion of the presentation, but also wanted to outline that next we'll be talking about the program audit that was conducted in 2019, as well as the administration of the oil and gas CCA with WAFWA, and then the updated business plan that we'll be talking about today. So with that, I'll turn it back and thank you very much for your attention. All right, so next to talk about the 2019 audit. Thank you for that, Kent. Really appreciate that great overview. And I came into my position back in 2019 and sat down with all the WAFWA directors, and we concluded we needed to do an audit by an independent person who would kind of tell us how the program was doing from their perspective. We had our own perspective, but we wanted an outside look at how we were doing. So we hired Ben Guion, who you'll hear next, and Ben did that audit, and that's really what started us down this path for evaluating how we were doing, what we could do to improve the program, and so Ben's was the first key step in that. So Ben, I would turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Brad. And I'm just gonna share my screen. I don't want to bore you to death with it's a pretty long report. It's available if you're curious and want to go through it. It is provided in the 2019 annual report of WAFWA together with response letter from WAFWA. But the way the audit was structured, there were 27 compliance points that were listed in the CCAA that were really clearly obligations of WAFWA and of SRF being the vehicle to implement the CCAA. And overall, it was, it was positive. 21 of those points were fully in compliance. So only 6 were left for discussion, and they can be organized on 3 topics. The first one was financial management, and that's probably the one that at the time was the most concerning. The program had decided to really go big in terms of the mitigation, but it was the program was bigger than what the financial resources would allow. So here you can see the other thing in financial management was the lack of a clear and transparent accounting process that will allow reporting to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the 2 key recommendations there that from the audit, which right-sides the program and establish a clear accounting process. Then the second bucket of issues, and there were 3 different points there, were around the annual reports. The first thing is that in the first part of the first 3 years of the program, WAFWA was supposed to submit reports every 6 months, and that was not done. That was done on an annual basis. And there was a point of non-compliance. Usually there were, those reports were not really clear. It was not easy to go back to the data, knowing exactly how much mitigation was provided, and it was just not covering all the information that was needed, especially on the finance side. And so the 2 key recommendations here were to really separate the CCA from the WCA, which is the other program that WAFWA is running related to the mitigation for the Lesser Prairie-Chicken, so that the data in that annual report will be really specific and clear, focused on the CCA. And the second one was to really change the report format so that it did not require anymore to have a PhD to be able to really go through the report, but it was something that the general public, with a little bit of effort, could comprehend and own. The last point of the 6 was the need for a program audit. And I want to be very clear that there's always been an annual financial audit of the program. So the issue is not at all financial. It was there's a requirement also that the program be audited on an annual basis for its ecological performance, if you want. And that was not being done. My audit was the first time that someone really looked at the conservation part of the program. And so the key recommendation here was to establish a process for that annual program audit that will be on the same scale of the financial audit, and the 2 could be then presented to the Fish and Wildlife Service on an annual basis. So those were the point. Again, if you want to go into more details, please just look at the report in look at the annual report, the 2019 annual report, which was released in 2020 as that audit. So now I'm going to pass it on to Chris to discuss how WAFWA responded to the audit.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everyone. I am Chris Moore. As Brad indicated, I was the acting executive director for WAFWA from April 1 of 2019 until August of this year, when WAFWA hired Zach. I was part-time in that acting role and served in that role as a result of a professional development opportunity. And now I'm helping Zach in an advisory role as he transitions into his new position as the full-time executive director for WAFWA. Ben presented a quick background on the audit. Thanks to Kent for his good background on the CCAA. As Ben indicated, audit results were presented to the WAFWA's Board of Directors at their annual meeting that was held in July 2019 in Kansas. After reviewing that report, the directors approved a motion which affirmed WAFWA's intention to continue to hold the CCAA, and they directed WAFWA staff to realign the CCAA to ensure financial and ecological sustainability and regulatory assurances for the bird, the Lesser Prairie-Chicken. A lot has happened since then. For the next several minutes, I'll present an overview of activities and changes that may be of interest to the folks on the call today. As Chand indicated, we will go through all the presentations, and at the end, we'll have time to answer any questions you might have. As Ben said, the audit was conducted for WAFWA in response to the recognition that there were insufficient funds available to administer the program. In early 2020, we sent the audit report to the Fish and Wildlife Service to satisfy our permit requirements, and included in the audit document, included the document in our annual report of the Lesser Prairie-Chicken. We also developed a formal response to the audit. That's also included in the annual Lesser Prairie-Chicken report. That annual report, the audit, the response can all be found along with a number of other documents on our website if you're interested in looking at those. As Ben indicated, the audit's key findings were that the mitigation program lacked the appropriate administrative funds to continue operating in its current form, and that some components of the mitigation framework might need to be modified. The audit report, as Ben indicated that we were in compliance with the majority of the let's see if I just lost my screen. The majority of the requirements, but that out of the 27 compliance points in the CCAA, we failed 6, including all points related to the financial management and points related to reporting, as Ben just indicated. We disagreed with some of those audit findings. You can again read our response in the documents that I previously referenced. And immediately following the audit, WAFWA representatives, along with some of the program participants, met with the Fish and Wildlife Service to address the points of potential non-compliance that were identified in Ben's audit report. And then we began implementing corrective actions. We immediately acted to improve our short-term financial situation and overall organizational structure by providing more oversight and accountability to the program, and specifically streamlined the program decisions and providing leadership for the program with the implementation of an executive director position. We also recognized the limitation of our finance team. We made some staffing changes there. We also changed our accounting procedures to make them more transparent. With Ben's help, we did an evaluation and determined that the administration of the program should cost about $500,000 per year, not the $2.5 million per year the program had cost us in prior years. We developed an appropriate administrative structure associated with that amount. That administrative structure now includes WAFWA's executive director, who provides overall program coordination and facilitation. We also have a Lesser Prairie-Chicken program coordinator, who's now Chanda, serving in that role. Chanda is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the program, including the support of stakeholders, program compliance, reports, and supervision of field staff. We also have a GIS data coordinator, who's also Chanda. We have a field staff, currently a contractor, who's helping us with site reviews. We also have 2 folks in Boise that help with the administrative support of the program. And the program is also supported by other contractors like Ben. Since 2019, when WAFWA made the decision to retain the program, there's been some big changes. WAFWA reduced its administrative costs by almost 70% in 2019 through 2020 through staff reductions, lower data management costs, and greater reliance on state fish and wildlife agencies for direct support. For example, our data management and GIS support services were performed by the University of Kansas from 2015 to 2019 at a rate of approximately $480,000 per year. We lowered those costs to $84,000 per year using an in-house contractor to perform those services. The aerial survey work that was conducted for several years using money from the Lesser Prairie-Chicken program, and that cost about $500,000 per year, was now paid for directly by the states. In addition, some of you may know that we purchased a building. WAFWA purchased a building in 2017 to house the program. That building was put up for sale in May of 2019, and we finally sold it in July of this year. All the money from that sale went back into the Conservation Endowment. Earlier this year, the board also voted to sell the Tate, that's now known as the Sunview Ranch, that was acquired in 2014 as part of the program. That ranch is now listed for sale at $10 million. We have had significant interest from a number of buyers. The ranch will be sold with conservation easement attached to continue to provide for the conservation benefit to the bird. And all the money from that sale will also be returned to the Conservation Endowment. The endowment that I've referenced several times supporting the program continues to be managed by the Royal Bank of Canada. We've significantly reduced the cost associated with the management of those funds by changing account structure and allocation strategy. Since July of 2019, we've worked closely with our industry partners to improve our financial reporting and make our financials more transparent. We've also formed an investment committee of financial experts that include industry representatives to advise the executive director on all investment-related matters related to the Conservation Endowment, including investment policies, strategies, and performance. As Ben indicated, in order to improve our reporting and communications, we created a separate annual report on the status of the CCAA program. That report is separate from the reporting that we were doing for the range-wide plan. We believe that that report helps increase transparency of the program and allows stakeholders to evaluate its compliance and effectiveness. In 2020, WAFWA hired ICF, a consulting firm headquartered in California. It has a national reputation of designing and assessing species mitigation programs. We hired them to lead the assessment of the compliance and effectiveness of our CCAA. For over a year, ICF worked closely with staff, Fish and Wildlife Service, and industry partners to develop and evaluate possible alternatives to our program. The focus of their work was both on the financial aspects and possible changes to the mitigation framework. As part of that evaluation, ICF developed a complex financial tool that looked at the financial viability of the CCAA into the future under different scenarios. It can also determine the ability of the CCAA to deliver expected long-term conservation based on specific budget constraints, as well as what kind of budget we might need under a specific mix of mitigation, including term contracts, permanent easements. Like a number of these reports that I've referenced, you can find the ICF report, including those findings, on our website if you're interested. So after all of this, that was a very quick overview. After all of this, an assessment was conducted at the end of 2020 that showed marked improvement in our compliance. As Ben indicated, out of the 6 non-compliant items that were identified in 2019, 2 were fully compliant in 2020, and 2 others were subsequently resolved with the help of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The 2 remaining points to be resolved were related to the financial sustainability of the CCAA. In 2021, we worked hard to address those unresolved issues, and as of May of 2021, we believe WAFWA has addressed the 2 remaining points and is implementing the program in full compliance with the CCAA related as it relates to the administrative costs and future conservation obligations. After consulting with industry participants in the Fish and Wildlife Service, we moved $10 million from the Conservation Endowment to the Administrative Endowment. That $10 million would generate enough revenue from the interest from its interest and dividends each year to cover the $500,000 in administrative cost that I referenced earlier. That transfer did not compromise our ability to deliver future conservation. The sale of the ranch and other actions that we've taken should more than cover that $10 million amount. The program's financial management now clearly delineates funding for conservation and funding for administrative costs, and better reporting oversight have been put in place. The program has sufficient funding to cover its current and future conservation obligations once we right-size the mitigation. Right now, the CCAA is providing an excess of mitigation compared to impacts. And Chanda, in her talk, will discuss our plans to strategically reduce the mitigation provided by the CCAA. WAFWA and state staff are working closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service to understand how the program may be able to provide additional conservation benefits in excess of what was originally required by the CCAA. In particular, WAFWA has conducted several analyses of the mitigation currently provided and produced models for potential future mitigation needs. WAFWA has also prepared an updated business plan for the program. We'll talk about that later. It includes the clarification of roles and responsibilities to increase transparency and accountability. And again, we'll be talking about that shortly. As we move closer to 2022, the bottom line is that the program is fully operational. We continue to make process improvements and implement our business plan. We're very mindful of our timeline and recognize the importance of May 2022 date as we continue to implement our new business plan. Importantly, we will continue to work with CCAA participants to ensure that they have access to the information they need to verify their level of participation and determine their own compliance in the program. Finally, this webinar represents our interest in outreach communications with industry participants, stakeholders, and interested public. We're always open to ideas for enhancing engagement and looking for ways to improve the program. With that, I've said quite a bit very quickly. Certainly, as I indicated earlier, we're going to have a time for questions and answers at the end. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brad. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Chris. It's a great summary. I wanted to just make a comment on behalf of the board and our president, Jen Salakis. We really appreciate Chris's leadership in the last 2 years. He's been terrific to work with and really helped us, advance the program the way that we wanted to and needed to. So really appreciate all your work on that, Chris. The other thing Chris mentioned about transparency. One of our real goals as directors was to understand the program and create more transparency and clarity. No one was trying to obscure things, but we felt like as we move forward, we could insert some mechanisms that made it easier for an outside person to understand and see what was going on. That was really important to us. The other thing I wanted to mention, so hopefully that's evidenced in the information we're presenting today. The other thing I wanted to mention is we've gone through this process evaluating both financial health of the CCAA program as well as the technical performance of that program. Key stakeholders were involved, most notably U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who was a terrific partner and had oversight of this, but at the same time they were challenging us and coaching us to move the program into the strongest position it could be. So we appreciate that. And of course, oil and gas was a key partner for the CCAA. They were the participants in that program, and they also were involved. So we did not make these changes in a vacuum. We got a lot of input from those folks. It was very valuable, very constructive to get us where we are today. So we really appreciate that. Next, we will go to the updated business plan. The fruit of all this process is a plan that we refer to as a roadmap on where we're going to head with this program in the future. And so we had this appear before the WAFWA directors last summer. This summer, 2021, they approved this business plan. And so we're working now to implement that. And to give you the details on that, I would offer you back Chris Moore and Ben Guion.
Thank you, Brad. I'm going to go through a number of points here, again, related to the business plan. I'll be relatively quick, and again, we'll have time for questions and answers at the end after we finish the presentations. Some of you may know, Brad just indicated that the updated business plan for WAFWA's Lesser Prairie-Chicken CCAA was approved by the WAFWA board in July, this last July. That plan replaces a plan that's currently in place, or that was currently in place as part of the range-wide plan. So we did have a business plan before. This one replaces it, and it's different. The goal is the same, but there's a lot of details that I think you'll find interesting. Certainly, I'll say this several times, I encourage folks to go to the business plan directly and take a look at it. It's a very user-friendly document. I think provides a lot of good content, and certainly I think can answer many of your questions about the CCAA. So if you open up the plan, it's right in the front, it says the goal of the business plan is to detail the strategies, systems, and processes that support the implementation of the CCAA. The plan focuses on the roles and responsibilities of the different parties involved in the CCAA, and there's several. And basically, we think the plan ensures transparency and accountability. As I indicated, we tried to make the document as user-friendly as possible. We wanted it to serve a couple different functions, both as an outreach tool and also as a plan to guide our program activities over the next several years. If you take a look at the plan, if you've had a chance to look at it, you may be struck by the fact that it's a little different than what you might expect for a typical business plan, if there's a typical business plan. We used a question and answer format that we believe allows for quick reference and addresses all aspects of the program. So what I plan to do over the next several minutes is highlight some of the content and important changes and what they mean for the program. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I encourage everyone to take a look at the document when they have the chance and read it for themselves. And certainly Ben's going to help me and will let me know if I forget anything as I go through my talk. There's in the plan, there's a section that describes the relationship between the CCAA and other initiatives. We continue to have some confusion with the overlap between the range-wide plan and the CCAA. And the section highlights the fact that the CCAA is one of the tools used to implement the conservation strategy in the range-wide plan. The range-wide plan and the CCAA are not the same. The plan is all about the CCAA. There's some discussion about the Wildlife Conservation Agreement, or WCA, but that's a separate agreement from the CCAA. And it's an agreement between WAFWA and developers whose projects have had or have an impact on LPC habitat. Whereas the CCAA is limited to oil and gas operators, other members of any industry, including oil and gas, can enroll in the WCA. We point out in the business plan that WCA is not a pre-listing tool, does not carry any assurances from the Fish and Wildlife Service. The business plan presents the various roles associated with participants, the Fish and Wildlife Service, WAFWA. It also discusses the various committees and responsibilities involved with the Lesser Prairie-Chicken program, the CCAA. Plan discusses governance and indicates that WAFWA, through the SRF board, has the primary responsibility for the CCAA. However, most of the decision-making authority has been delegated to the LPCIC, or the Lesser Prairie-Chicken Initiative Council. The council charter was also approved by the board in July, and that charter requires membership that includes directors from the 5 chicken states, a representative from WAFWA's executive committee, and for the first time, a member from industry. Our current industry rep is Ben Shepard. The business plan also requires that we have a Lesser Prairie-Chicken Investment Advisory Committee to advise the executive director and the council on all investment-related matters that relate to the conservation endowments, including investment policy, strategies, and performance. The new business plan establishes a new Lesser Prairie-Chicken Technical Working Group to advise the executive director and the council on the scientific integrity of the CCAA. This group is different than the interstate working group that's part of the range-wide plan, and we haven't established it yet, but we will. The plan also calls for a separate advisory committee. This advisory committee is different from the range-wide plan advisory committee, and this advisory committee will serve to provide recommendations on any aspect of the CCAA and the Lesser Prairie-Chicken program to the executive director and the council. For example, one of the examples we point out in the plan is that the executive director may request that the advisory committee review and provide its opinion of proposed changes to the CCAA or its strategy. And like some of these other groups, we've yet to form this particular advisory committee, but we will. Once we have that group formed, plan notes that we hope that we'll be able to use the stakeholder representatives on that advisory committee to not only provide advice to the executive director and the council, but also allow us to communicate better and disseminate information to our various constituency. The plan has a detailed section on conservation. It states that the main conservation goal of the CCAA is to support the conservation strategy set forth in the range-wide plan by implementing a framework for avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of impacts to chickens from oil and gas activities. The conservation strategy that's detailed in the plan is similar to the one that was in the original document. That is basically that conservation strategy is based on habitat quality. And it gets into some details and says the number of offset units generated on a specific acre of property is related to the quality of the habitat. Something that Kent went over in his initial talk. It means that as habitat quality increases, the property generates more offset units. Basically, the focus of the strategy is to basically secure existing lower quality habitat and increase its quality through range management. Based on that, a net conservation benefit means that the CCAA provides more offset units, the number of impact units. As Kent indicated, there's a 2-to-1 ratio that's detailed in the plan. The plan notes that WAFWA needs an absolute minimum to carry enough offset units to maintain compliance with the CCAA. It also discusses that we need to have a buffer of additional offset units to allow participants to purchase offset units when they need them, without having to wait for additional properties to enroll. By October 1 of each year, participants are required by the plan to provide WAFWA with an estimate of their anticipated development for the following year. Because it takes an average of 12 to 36 months for WAFWA to procure new properties for mitigation. We plan to maintain a surplus of offset units in each ecoregion to equal either the maximum of the aggregate amount predicted by the participants or 2 years of the average offset unit demand for that particular ecoregion. One of the other things that the plan details is something that I mentioned earlier. It requires that WAFWA sell its ranch. And we sell that ranch with the Lesser Prairie-Chicken conservation easement attached. And that we transfer the dedicated endowment sales associated with the ranch back to the conservation endowment. That ranch is listed for sale now, as I indicated earlier, again, we're getting a lot of interest. The ranch is listed at $10 million, which is what it was appraised at. The ranch can also be used to solve another problem for us. And this is something that we've had quite a bit of discussion with internally as well as with Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of folks on this call understand that the Lesser Prairie-Chicken program does not differentiate between the mitigation for the CCAA and the one for the WCA. The result is that the mitigation for both programs coexist on the different LPC properties. It's not possible to clearly pinpoint those that are related to the CCAA, and those that are related to the WCA. This makes it difficult for us to demonstrate the net conservation benefit of the CCAA itself, and the WCA participants cannot easily understand and demonstrate to their shareholders and users how their funds were used. What we plan to do is separate the mitigation arising from the CCAA and the WCA by transferring all the mitigation for impacts associated with the WCA to the Sunview Ranch. Our analysis indicates we should be able to use all the permanent credits generated by the Sunview Ranch to mitigate the WCA impacts, regardless of their location. Although the ranch is located in an ecoregion where few CCAA impacts are expected, transferring the WCA impacts to the ranch would not limit our ability to deliver mitigation in this ecoregion and would reduce the mitigation needs in other ecoregions with higher demand for mitigation. The plan also goes into some detail as how we ensure the permanence of our conservation actions and as well as our relationship with our landowners. Some of the folks on the call understand that we conducted an additional landowner outreach when the CCA was first launched to find properties that were suitable for these offset units. Since many more landowners applied than we needed, we haven't conducted any additional landowner outreach since then. If at some point in the future, the CCA needs additional offset units, WAFWA's executive director is going to reach out to WAFWA's network of partners to find willing landowners and help select properties that have the highest potential. Those partners can include private landowners, state wildlife agencies, cattlemen, state organizations, and conservation organizations such as Land Trust. Owners of properties that provide temporary mitigation are required to enter in either a 5-year or a 10-year contract with WAFWA. After the contract term is over, the landowner is free to request a renewal or leave the program. WAFWA can terminate any temporary contract with a 30-day notice to the landowner. Once a contract is terminated or expires, all the mitigation values on that property are also terminated, including any restored acres. As such, a plan notes that we should focus restoration activities on permanent easements for written properties. Several times we mentioned the fact that we do have reporting requirements. The plan discusses those reporting requirements and the fact that we'll produce an annual report for the Fish and Wildlife Service. That annual report is posted on the website and is available to the general public. There's 2 years, 2019 and 2020, currently on the website. The plan mentions a couple of times the fact that we need to right-size the mitigation. Analysis conducted for us indicates that there is more offset units available than what are required under the CCAA. We can reduce those offset units and the associated iterative mitigation payments while still maintaining our net conservation benefit. That's something that Chandler will be discussing when she talks about implementation plans for the program. One thing to note, and I'm sure that there are a number of folks in this call that are very interested, is that the CCAA is not currently open to new participants. It's not open to new participants. No decision has been made on potential reopening. If enrollment to the CCAA becomes open again, prospective participants would enroll by signing a certificate of inclusion that specifies the total acreage in the property description for the enrolled property. One thing that we have done is decided to allow current participants to enroll additional land beginning October 1. So we made the decision, the council's made the decision to allow current participants to enroll additional lands beginning October 1. We plan to get a notice out to all participants this week. Chandler will also discuss that when she gives her presentation shortly. But before we get to Chanda, I'll turn it over to Ben to provide some additional detail related to compliance and future audits. Ben.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. Very briefly, so we worked on that specific requirement to have an annual performance audit and how to provide the same level of transparency, of credibility that participants and the general public can expect from the financial reports of WAFWA, which if you've not looked at them, the 990, which is the form that WAFWA is required to submit to the IRS, is provided on WAFWA's website together with the audit, the financial audit. So the way we decided to move forward is that annual audit will be an audit of the annual report of WAFWA, the same way the financial audit is an audit of the annual financial statements of WAFWA. So we will parallel the system, and so next year you will see the first page of the annual report will be the statement of the auditor. That's the annual report is a fair reflection of the current status of the program. And there will be two parts of that audit. The first one will be assessing again those 27 compliance points that the CCA mandates, and also having the third party compare the what's in the annual report with what is in the database that WAFWA used called the WCT, which is where all of that magic happens. And so the same way your accountant will check the balances at the bank and make sure that they are appropriately reflected on your financial reports, same way that your third party will look at the WCT and look at the endowment with Royal Bank of Canada and make sure that those were properly reflected in the annual report. So, very straightforward term of reference for the auditor, and so that's will allow us every year to have consistency in that reporting and in that auditing of the annual report. And that has been reviewed by the service. So that was one of the first things that WAFWA shared with the Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that everybody was on the same page to be able to move forward. This year, the ICF report constituted that third party program audits. Well, in 2019, my audit was the program audit. So for the past 2 years, WAFWA has been compliant on that point and moving forward using that new process. WAFWA will maintain compliance with that specific point.
Brad, I think with that, we can move on to Chanda. Chanda, if you're ready.
I am. Thank you, Chris. Okay. All right. So this tears off of what Chris and Ben have just overviewed about the organizational changes, just a quick little timeline of activities. Got the plan finalized shortly thereafter. We made the organizational changes. Most of those are wrapped up. We are now kind of moving into the operational changes. And so those are the things that are slated for October and November. So I'm going to cover those briefly, just so you kind of have a feel for those upcoming activities. So the first thing that we wanted to do was get a good standard operating procedures in place that detailed all the activities and tasks. There's a lot of moving parts to this plan, and so we wanted to make sure that we had them all efficiently outlined in one document where we could reference. Standard operating procedures is basically a step-by-step guidance of instructions, and it includes all activities from the WAFWA administrative side, the geospatial technical side, all of our tools that we operate under, like Ben had mentioned, the WCT online tool. I'll talk about that in a second. And it's really a flow of how those things work through time in the step-by-step instructions. So we're modifying that to operate under the new business plan. And in coordination with that, we've also got what we're calling a roadmap established. It's basically a calendar of all those activities on an annual basis so that we ensure everything is getting captured and taken care of on time. And the online portal that Ben had mentioned, it's the WAFWAWCT.org. It's basically our online management solution. It's what we use to do the field work. It can be downloaded onto iPads, and the team takes them out and does all the vegetation work. It's our data management, our financial management. Everything's wrapped up into this one tool. So one of the new items from the business plan was a need to separate out the CCAA from the WCA so that we could adequately track both. So that's being accomplished right now. We've got a team working on that, and that should be wrapped up by October 1st. So that is the plan, to have that all ready to go. The other item is right sizing. Chris had mentioned this about maintaining an eco-region surplus of debits and credits, or credits for the debits. And so he outlined a process for that. And right now we're taking a look at where we're at with all of our conservation properties, our track history of what's coming in for debits and what is the average, so that we can identify and make sure that we've got enough surplus of credits to address the debit demand, but not so much of a surplus that it doesn't make sense to do so. So that's what we're in the process of working on right now, and that'll continue into October, and we should have that all wrapped up by about November 1st. So one of the items that Chris had just mentioned also was the open enrollment to existing participants into the CCAA. And so this is a little bit of just a workflow of what to anticipate coming up. We're going to be submitting a letter to all of our existing participants that outlines this process, so you have this information in hand. But it's going to be a simple little 3-step enrollment process. If you'd like to get some additional lands into the program, basically just need company contact name and a point of contact so that we've got a direct person to communicate with, and a property description of the new enrollment. And that can be a legal description, shapefile, Google Earth, pretty much can take any form for that. And then an estimate of how many projects you think might be coming in for 2020. And it's simple as that. We're just getting that emailed over to me. We're going to be opening that enrollment October 1st. Those letters will be going out shortly, like Chris had mentioned. So just hang on to them for right now. As soon as you get the letter, it'll have this guidance in it for you. And then once we receive that information, we're just going to be revising Exhibit A of the company's agreement. And WAFWA, our admin, will be working up an estimate so that you've got that in hand. And once the agreement's signed and the first year's invoice is paid, companies can start submitting projects. So it's a pretty straightforward little process. And with that, I will turn it back over to Brad.
All right, thank you, Chanda. That was great. So this gets us to the last portion of our webinar, to the Q&A panel discussion. So you have the benefit of all the experts that you've heard talking so far to tackle questions that you're sending. Continue to forward those questions via the chat to Chanda. We have about a half dozen so far, and the ones I've seen so far can kind of be broken down into two categories. The first kind of about the conservation process and some detailed questions about that, and then the others more about the financial. So we'll start with the conservation questions, and they've been forwarded to Kent. Most of these are in his backyard. So Kent, let's start with these. And so the first question is, what's a restored or an enhanced acre?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. That's a good question. So briefly, restored is increasing habitat quantity, while enhanced is increasing habitat quality. And so for a restored acres, you're basically taking area that was not habitat and turning it into lesser prairie chicken habitat. So some examples of this, the easiest one, one of the easiest ones, is cropland conversion to grassland. So cropland is not considered lesser prairie chicken habitat. Replanting it to native prairie, and then once that becomes usable lesser prairie chicken habitat, the restoration has been completed. Another easy one for restoration example is brush management. So the removal of specifically eastern red cedar, especially in the mixed grass ecoregion, and then mesquite down in the shinnery oak ecoregion. And then enhancement, again, is increasing habitat quality. And so there, primarily, we're talking about prescribed grazing. And so in the context of the CCAA and the conservation components of that, that is incentivizing landowners who are enrolled in the program to decrease their stocking rates in order to increase the amount of residual grass cover that is there continuous, for the next year for nesting habitat is the primary example of that. So basically restoration is increasing habitat quantity, enhancement is increasing habitat quality.
Great, great. Thank you, Kent. That's a textbook answer. Good job. Second question has to do with the Lesser Prairie-Chicken range. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but the Lesser Prairie-Chicken occurs in 5 states that we call the chicken states: Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. And that's the folks, it's biologists like Kent from that make up his interstate working group. And they've been the ones involved with range changes, shifts, which has made it a little bit tricky. And then also those estimates, as Chris mentioned, a function that was performed using those monies from WAFWA now is shifted over in the states, which we really appreciate, have been willing to take on that work to do these range and population evaluations. So the key part of this question is there a KMZ or a shapefile available, Kent, that represents the most up-to-date range in those 5 states?
Yeah, so what we used in this presentation, and that is the specific to the CCAA, which is important, can be found online at short for Southern Great Plains Chat, but SGP Chat, so sgpchat.org. And so that shapefile can be found there, and we can post that in the chat box as well. this is a good opportunity as well to mention for the audience here that there is a slight difference between what is identified formally in the CCAA as the coverage area of the CCAA and what the Fish and Wildlife Service used based on the Interstate Working Group's recommendation, what the Fish and Wildlife Service used for their analysis area in the Species Status Assessment, the SSA that came out earlier this year. There is a slight difference because Fish and Wildlife Service was looking for the most up-to-date information on where the species occurred. And so the Interstate Working Group provided information based on that. But it is very important to note that analysis area used in the SSA is different and not associated at all with the CCAA or any of the other mitigation programs out there. There is a clear difference between those. And so if people are interested in that SSA analysis area, they can email me directly. Again, I'll put my information in the chat box, but that is slightly different. It's not any more or less relevant to the CCAA. Again, the CCAA has an established coverage area that is set for those 30 years unless it's formally changed with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Great, thank you, Kent. So the third question, it's right in with that. How do the population estimates shown compare with the population goal of the range-wide plan, Kent?
Yeah, and another excellent question. So the range-wide plan identifies a range-wide, a 10-year range-wide population goal of 67,000 birds, which of course is significantly higher than what we currently have. As I mentioned earlier, the current 3-year rolling average range-wide is just over 32,000 birds. And so we're at approximately half of that 10-year range-wide goal. However, it is important to note that there are eco-regional differences in there as well, where the shortgrass in central and northwest Kansas, the 10-year population goal for that ecoregion is 25,000 birds. And we have exceeded that population goal both in 2020 and 2021. Again, not just looking at the 3-year averages, but just kind of those point estimates per year. But for the other ecoregions, you'll note that there's certainly challenges that we've experienced with those populations, and we're working to increase those populations as well. But point being, whether range-wide or within ecoregions, it's important to remember that those goals were developed so that there was a transparent metric for how we were doing as a conservation community in increasing lesser prairie chicken populations. And so, you know, we may not meet that 67,000 10-year goal, but we are making progress toward it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Kent. Good answers. So we'll shift to these other questions, largely about the finances and program performance. Chanda, I might mention to you, I know you've got some other questions coming in. I'm trying to see those. I'm having a little difficulty right now, so I may end up using your help and teaming up with you to get to that third set of questions. So just that's a shot across the bow that I may need your help here in a minute. So the second set of questions, excuse me, has to do with Fish and Wildlife Services or federal government's perspective on how the program is going. And I'll pitch this over to Chris, but all I'd say, referencing back to my earlier comment, is as we've worked through this, through the audits, through the ICF report and that process, we did that hand in hand with Fish and Wildlife Service. So we were getting input all along the way and continue to have frequent conversations with the service to get their feedback on how we're doing, if we're going in the right direction. And so that's been a kind of a constant conversation that we've been having over the last couple of years. But Chris, I'd pitch that over to you. The question is, has the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly Interior Solicitor, done a review that we're aware of this program and its compliance?
So I think the the answer is, you started the answer to the question, Brad, by saying that we've been involved with the Fish and Wildlife Service all along. They've been a valuable partner, and we've gone back and forth with them on a number of issues, including parts related to conservation and the financial aspects of the program. We recently had an exchange of letters with Amy regarding compliance with the program. We indicated in our letter that based on the actions we had taken in 2021, we were fully compliant with the requirements of the CCAA. We received a letter back from Amy Luters, the regional administrator for the Fish and Wildlife Service, indicating that they still had some questions about those compliance points, and we've gone back and forth with them over that. So at this point, I don't know if there's been a formal review of the program by a solicitor associated with the Department of Interior. But I do know that they've had folks within the Fish and Wildlife Service actively looking at our program. And I think, Ben, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I mean, just to be clear, the business plan itself doesn't need any formal approval from the service, because it is not the CCAA. So I don't think that the solicitor would want to spend any time reviewing the business plan, and that is really Amy and her team who are, in charge of making sure that the business plan is going to get us where WAFWA needs to go with that, with the CCAA.
Good.
So I'd emphasize one thing, Brad, which is, again, pointing out, we went over it very quickly in the presentations today, but in terms of compliance, if you look at the 27 compliance, issues that we have with or that we need to address with the CCAA, the 27 compliance points, we're compliant with 21 of them. We're compliant with 21 of them. We're now compliant with the other 6 as well, based on our work over the last couple of years. And has been indicated that has been an ongoing, has involved ongoing work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I think we're in great shape.
Good. Thank you, Chris and Ben. The second question, that one was kind of directed at how is Fish and Wildlife Service viewing the program, the health of the program, and so on. The next question has to do with how are our oil and gas partners seeing this, and really they are very capable of answering for themselves. We don't have them on the panel today, so if someone's interested in connecting directly with them, we can help you do that offline after this webinar. But the question has to do with how is oil and gas doing with the decisions about that we've made over the years about managing this program. They specifically mentioned the purchase of the building and recent sale, as you pointed out, Chris, the ranch purchase and the sale that's we're working on right now for that, and how does industry view those steps in our management. The other thing I'd throw in, wasn't included in the question though, is the shift from a large staff to basically start this program up in the early years, as you mentioned, Chris, down to the staff that we have now. So Chris, how would you summarize our conversations with oil and gas and their view of those kind of the financial management of the program?
So I'd say in one word, they've been extensive. We've had many discussions with our industry partners and the industry participants over the last 2 years. They've been directly involved in the realignment of the program. They've understood after probably a year going over the financials, looking exactly how the money was spent, where it was spent, why it was spent. We point out when we talk about the program that looking back, we can say that probably wasn't a good decision, or that may have not been the best thing to do. But at the time, remember how this happened. Industry came forward with a proposal, asked WAFWA to get involved. Things happened very quickly. And now looking back, may not have been the best thing to buy a ranch, or it may not have been the best thing to buy a building. But at the time, folks thought that was a good decision. What's happened since then is we determined that, in fact, we don't want ownership of either one of those, the building or the ranch, for a number of reasons. The building's been sold. The money has been returned back to the endowment. When the ranch sells, that money will go into the conservation endowment as well. So all that money is going to go back to the endowment for future conservation needs. And one thing to understand about the ranch is that there's a big portion of the endowment associated with money going out every year to support the ranch, right? That becomes part of the larger endowment as well. So not only do you have the money from the sale of the ranch going into the endowment, but you also have a portion of the endowment that's associated with the annual payments to us as the ranch owners, that going back into the endowment. So all that money is going back where it's going to be used for future conservation. We've had a lot of analyses of the program in terms of what to do relative to the administration of the program. We determined that about $500,000 per year should be enough to support the program in its current form. Of course, if we decide to expand and have new participants, or if there's things that change, we'll have to revisit that. Right now, $500,000 is sufficient, and we have the money in the administrative endowment to support that. So things are very different now than they were 2, 3, 4, or 5 years ago.
Yeah, good answer. And I mean, it's clear to us as we've evaluated what we did in the past and where we should be now. Nobody ever said that people had any ill intent in the past. Hindsight's always 20/20. I mean, I should have invested in Microsoft, right? So as we look back then, we understand why they did that back then. We understand that's not a great fit for where we're at right now. And in consultation with all our partners, we said, okay, we ought to make these changes. So the important thing is we're moving to a better place, or a place that's most appropriate for where the program is right now. And the other thing, don't forget, in the middle of that, we were in an oil and gas boom not that long ago when the program was beginning, and changes the economics, quite a bit from when it slides and less development's going on. And so that's something you just can't predict. And so you have to make adjustments when those kind of changes occur. And we have. So thanks for that answer, Chris. The last question has to do, and this, Chris, you may want to answer this. Ben, you may want to chime in, or Chanda, you might want to also. The last question in this group is, can you touch on the reliance of the CCAA on WCA, or Wildlife Conservation Agreement funds? And Chris, I'll start with you, but you guys can team up on it if you want.
Yeah, I think, Ben, if you don't mind, I think I'm going to turn to you to see if you can address that first, and then if needed, I'll jump in.
Sure. So that was one of the point of the audit, is that the funding for the CCA and the WCA are still to this point entirely intermingled. So there is absolutely no way to say that a specific dollar paid by a company under the WCA or the CCAA has been used for something, a specific property or another. And that's definitely an issue. And so that's why separating the very clearly the mitigation that is for the WCA from the mitigation for the CCAA is absolutely critical, so that everybody can be comfortable that they have mitigation that they can show to their board of directors, and they're very clear on what that is. In order to keep things simple for the WCA, that's why there's that focus on, instead of doing half permanent and half temporary, to do 100% permanent mitigation, so that you don't have to track. This temporary mitigation, by definition, moves on the landscape, and so it's one place 1 year, it could move the following year. Now the WCA participants know exactly where their dollars have been used, and it also reduces the cost. TNC is managing that easement for the Lesser Prairie-Chicken, which is very efficient, also because it's over 20,000 acres in one block. So all of that creates efficiencies for the use of the WCA funds, and allow us to very cleanly separate the two. So moving forward, that would not even be a question, because there would be no transfer between the two. So any funds in the WCA just serve the WCA, and that's it.
Good. Good. That's a good answer, Ben. So that was one of the key areas where, as we dug into this and our new eyes on the program, Ben said, it's hard to track this. Same thing Chanda said. So we really wanted to create more clarity in there. Not that anybody was trying to obscure things, but we just felt as newcomers to the program, it was a little hard to navigate that. So we've been really trying to make it more clear, more transparent. And that gets to our next question, Ben, and I'll pitch this to you. This is kind of some things that you talked about earlier, but gives you a chance to kind of refresh that. The question is, will you talk about the improvements we've made in accounting and transparency?
Yeah, and that's so in accounting and transparency, the first level is really that separation between the CCA and the WCA, which is still, being worked through the sale of the ranch. So that would be one. We also clarified the some of the properties may be managed directly by states. It was a little messy to just pay the states for management. So some of the states, especially Texas, has accepted to take on the financial cost of doing the management to avoid any perception of potential self-dealing. So that has been cleared. Now within the accounting system, the key change that is being implemented is really to take into account long-term liabilities for the program. And that's where it's a little bit tricky, because we have accounting principles such as GAAP that may not, they were not designed for a conservation program. They were designed for a big multinational company. And so I think the team really stuck to those principles when we need a more flexible accounting system that account, especially for the fact that WAFWA enters into those 10-year contracts that can be canceled on a 30-day with a 30-day notice. But the reality is WAFWA has been a long-term partner of landowners, and except in very specific situations, is not expecting to renege on those contracts. And so we need to have a system that really accounts for those long-term liabilities, because that was the main issue raised by the audit, is that in some ways WAFWA was operating on a year-to-year basis and being a little bit blind to those long-term liabilities, which requires us right now to right-size the program, because we lost track of that. So that's the main accounting change. It's going to be taking into account the long-term liabilities. Okay.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that from a less technical perspective is, as I headed into this, I always thought of audits, as being financial. It's clear though, and Ben and Chris taught me this, that there was also the conservation performance portion of this. So we've split those into two, so that each year there'll be an evaluation of how we're doing financially, but also the key conservation metrics that we're required to meet will be audited independently annually also. And that was something that was important to the service. And so glad to do that. That's part of the program requirements. So another part of that transparency. So thank you, Ben. Next question is about investment, folks. And I'll kind of answer this. We're a bunch of biologists by and large. Ben's the outlier. That's why we hired him, because he's a different animal from the rest of us. And so the question had to do with investment people that are involved in this process. And I guess Chris, you may read that question differently than I do, but I would say that's why we've hired Ben to consult with us, because he has that expertise that we don't have. But Chris, chime in there if there's a better way to answer that question, would you?
Sure. I'm not sure if I understand the question, Brad, but let me see if I can help with by saying this. We have in the new business plan that was approved in July, we detail the importance of an investment advisory committee. That investment advisory committee exists to provide advice to the executive director and the LPCIC relative to the investments that we have in that conservation endowment. We have advisors that work with us through the Royal Bank of Canada. That's the group that manages that particular account. And we've worked closely with them to reduce our investment cost and also modify that allocation formula to give us a better return. So we have them, they serve as advisors. What we need to do as a result of this new business plan is reinvigorate this investment advisory committee and reach out to our industry partners as well as the state participants and see who we can get to participate on the committee that has the financial background to actually provide some investment advice in cooperation and coordination with the Royal Bank of Canada, so that we're not just relying on them. In fact, we have some outside folks that are looking at it as well. I'd say that the Royal Bank of Canada folks have provided us with solid, sound advice over the last several years. Certainly it's nothing, we don't have anything against them. It's just that we want to hear from some other folks as well. So is that what you were looking for, Brad?
Yeah, it is. It is. That's very helpful. Thank you. And let me take a pause here and mention our questions are really piling up, and we will not be able to get to all those today. So what we'll do is, this will extend the amount of time it'll take for us to have this recording and the transcripts available to you. But what we will promise you to do is to get to as many questions as we can, and the half hour, 25 minutes we have left. The questions that we don't get to, we will put in front of our experts, and we will have a written response, and we'll attach that to the recording so that those are available to all of you to look at both the questions and then the responses. So we'll make that promise today. So don't be frustrated if we can't quite get to your questions today, but we'll do our best in the time we have. So the last question there kind of having to do with finances, goes between the financial side and then also the conservation side. So it's a little bit complex, but the bottom line question is, as we paid out money for easements and land holdings, we're getting ready to sell the ranch and have those funds returned to the conservation endowment. And the question is, and Chris, see if this feels like something you can easily answer. The question is, with those things having happened or in process, what's our motivation? I think I know your answer, and I think you kind of already explained it as you talked about the evolution of our kind of business model. But so that the first question is what, as we've spent money on easements and land holdings, we purchased the ranch and are getting ready to sell it back. From your perspective, what's the strategy?
In terms of, yeah, I guess I think I turned to my money guy, Ben, and let him address how to answer that, because I'm not sure what the questioner is actually asking us. You know?
Right. I wasn't sure either, but Ben, yeah, Ben, take a shot. That's and then
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
So there are several layers to that. First, the way WAFWA provides the mitigation is really through a conservation easement. So here, WAFWA purchased the land and transfer the conservation easement to the Nature Conservancy. Really, in most cases, WAFWA just buys the conservation easement so that it is transferred on to the Nature Conservancy, doesn't hold the fee title. And there are two reasons for that. One is philosophical, the other one is financial. Financially, it doesn't make any sense to have, like, you get the same amount of mitigation, whether you get just the easement or the easement and the fee simple that's left. So here, there's $10 million that could be used to additional mitigation, because the conservation easement will stay in place. The buyer who's likely to buy that ranch is a conservation buyer. So we will have all that conservation impact. So why freeze $10 million? Well, that's the financial answer. It's just way more efficient to do it to do it that way. Easements are better than buying the land. The second one is really, I think, philosophical. WAFWA buying the land for conservation means potentially displacing a family who's on that ranch for. In that case, those were investors, but it could be a family that has owned the ranch for generations. And I don't think that WAFWA thinks that it is in the business of managing land as opposed to working with landowners to really promote conservation on family farms and family ranches. And that's a much better model than going in, buying land for conservation and removing people from the land. And that's purely philosophical, but it's very important to WAFWA's way of doing business.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that answer, Ben. And so you get it from the technical perspective, Ben's expertise on your strategy in this. What I would point out is I know that in the early days when that was bought, there were some other factors that the team was considering at that point, and those have changed, right? So what may have made sense back then didn't to us in the current day. And so that's the reason for the shift, as Ben mentioned, and we're very comfortable with where we're headed with that now. The last question in this multi-part question has to do with, is WAFWA able to secure the land needed for Lesser Prairie-Chicken strongholds? And this is kind of a question that Kent may want to help with, or Ben, as we talk about this philosophy of trying to create strongholds throughout the range that will withstand the perturbations that will come to Lesser Prairie-Chicken population. So Ken, if you want to start, and then Ben, jump in if you want.
Yeah, good question. From a range-wide plan perspective, the Interstate Working Group and our partners, when developing that, recognized and defined what a stronghold for Lesser Prairie chickens would look like. And so there's associated criteria with that. Requires Lesser Prairie chicken occupancy, must be at least 25,000 acres of intact grassland that's all connected, and multiple others. And then we identified goals that hopefully within 10 years, we would be able to have at least one of these strongholds, areas that meet all of these criteria, secured by, year 10 of the range-wide plan. But it is important to note that the CCAA itself does not contribute directly toward that. It can, but it's not required to. An example of that is the WAFWA purchase and of the conservation easement of the ranch is one example of that. And so by using the easement associated with that ranch that's now on there, that's been purchased, we've accomplished one stronghold within the Sand Sage ecoregion. However, any other conservation partner, any landowner can also contribute to those stronghold criteria as well, and help us meet those range-wide plan goals of at least one stronghold per ecoregion. So it's important to note that the range-wide plan identifies that as a goal and what the criteria for those strongholds are. However, it is important to note that there's no obligation of the CCAA specifically to contribute to that range-wide goal.
Okay, Ben?
I will also say that the creation of the strongholds is not the only goal, especially if you're looking at the Fish and Wildlife Service guidance on, can't remember the exact name. It's basically the ecological needs of the species and how that's going to be met by conservation programs. Strongholds, top priority. Second top priority is reducing fragmentation and increasing connectivity between the strongholds, because you don't want to have populations that just can't connect to each other. And so that's where also some of those properties have been focused on reducing the fragmentation, especially capturing some of those properties where restoration could be implemented, especially removing woody vegetation. And that's expensive, But that's really something that's been implemented. And I think that moving forward, something that was identified as part of the business plan is working closely with WAFWA's partners, whether it is the federal agencies and OCS some programs, or with different land trusts to try to really aggregate those resources, because WAFWA itself will never be able to create all the strongholds that are needed to save the Lesser Prairie-Chicken. I mean, that is just unrealistic to imagine that they will be that much in the CCA, especially because the industry has been reacting positively, as Kent has indicated, to the CCA by increasing avoidance and minimization measures. So the CCA is in some ways victim of its own success, is that the more successful it is, the less resources it has to create more stronghold, because there are less impact. So it's just a strategy with a lot of partners.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for you guys teaming up on that, Ben and Kent. Next question I see, let's go to you, Chris, on this one. It says, is there a summary document identifying the differences between the old and the new business plans?
Short answer is no. They're very different documents. So there's no like side, it would be tough even to do a side by side, although I'm thinking that, just trying to think about how you might want to do that, it would be difficult. They're so different. That would be, hard to figure out what exactly changed from one section to the next. But, I think if you spent a lot of time and you looked at the new plan and then looked at the old plan, you'd be able to figure out, some of the differences.
Right. They're kind of different animals, right?
Right.
So it's not apples to apples. Yeah. So,
Yeah. And again, I think as I pointed out, and could talk to this as well, the format is for the new plan is very user friendly, and you can find very easily an answer to a particular question by just looking at the table of contents, seeing all those questions there. The old version, not so much, a little more detailed, a little harder to find some things, and it doesn't address some of the things that we addressed in the new business plan as well. So, and
I would just add, you can find it in the range-wide plan. Maybe that's also it's never been published as a separate document because it's one of the appendices to the range-wide plan. So you can find it there, and it was indeed drafted before the CCA was even really finalized. So there were a lot of holes by definition because the program had not started yet.
yeah, a good point. Yeah, total separate ends of the process, right? From the way in the beginning before the range-wide plan to where we're at today. So very different. The other thing you'll find if you haven't looked at the business plan yet, I'll tell you, when I first saw the format, I thought, well, this is unlike any business plan I've ever seen, because they started with questions, why are we doing this? How do we do this? And it's very user-friendly. Like Chris said, easy to follow through and easy to see what's going on. So I invite you to look at that on our website. Okay, the next question, let's take this to you, Kent, and it's a little tricky because it talks about the program recognizing that there's going to be habitat impacts, but then the question says we mitigate with habitat enhancement instead of habitat gain, which I'm not sure is exactly accurate, but it says within the plan we have habitat loss that occurs, but we mitigate with habitat enhancement instead of habitat gain. Is this, I guess I'd invite you, Kent, if that makes sense to you, to kind of respond to that supposition.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. A reasonable question here, and we've certainly had a number of discussions with a number of our partners on the impacts that the oil and gas, in this case for the CCAA, have on the landscape, and the transition from the habitat that's impacted by that from usable to non-usable based on the analysis and how it's calculated within the CCAA mitigation framework. But it, as Brad mentioned in the question, it is offset by, as we mentioned before in my presentation, by more than 1 acre of restoration to date, as well as more than 83,000 acres of what we talked about earlier of habitat enhancement. And I will say, though, that from the start, the range-wide plan and associated mitigation framework, of which the CCAA is part, recognize the importance and role that habitat quality and increasing habitat quality, or that enhancement, has for lesser prairie chicken populations. Because lesser prairie chickens can and do occur at relatively low densities in a lot of the range, of the occupied range. And so by making relatively simple and quite honestly efficient changes in especially prescribed grazing, we can go from something like 4 birds per square mile for a density of lesser prairie chickens to 8 or 10 birds per square mile with very well managed prescribed grazing. And so those increases in numbers are often very much more efficient when we're talking about increasing and enhancing habitat quality versus what we have to do for habitat restoration. That's not to minimize the importance of habitat restoration at all, but we also recognize the importance of that habitat quality aspect. And so I'll say that is an important aspect of this. And so that habitat quality aspect is why those habitat scores, the HIG scores that we mentioned earlier, are so important. And it's important to note too that was the system that was developed and approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service for use with the oil and gas CCAA. And so that's what we're we need to use for assessing how much habitat quality is enhanced and offset. And so while the use of the HIG, that habitat score, isn't maybe not typical from other mitigation frameworks out there, it is what was approved by the service and what we use to guide our conservation management decisions within the CCAA.
Good. Thank you, Kent. That's a good answer. All right, looking through these questions. A question came up, which is a good one. And we've mentioned this term stronghold, Lesser Prairie-Chicken stronghold. And the question is that something that, I don't know the answer to this, Kent. Is that something that Fish and Wildlife Service designates, or is that just a general term we use for an area that is really stable? What's your response to the criteria for a stronghold as we talk about the one down in the Sand Sage Prairie?
Yeah, again, good question. And in the range-wide plan, and I don't have the exact page in front of me, I probably should, but the range-wide plan, there's a table that outlines the definitions, the criteria for strongholds that need to be met in order to be considered that. And that is based on, as Ben mentioned earlier, the guidance that Fish and Wildlife Service provided in I think 2014 or 13, anyway, back then. And so you can see the checklist of various properties at the time of writing in 2013 that were being considered for how we can accomplish some of those strongholds. But overall, there's no certification or designation other than trying to check all the boxes through those criteria. And so the service certainly does go through, so for example, with conservation banking, there are criteria used for those conservation bank properties that don't necessarily have to meet or be different, may be different from what the range-wide plan criteria are. And so there's no certification of those other than us, Interstate Working Group, and all the committee structure associated with the range-wide plan, doing our due diligence in ensuring that the properties that we are calling strongholds actually are meeting those criteria.
Good answer. Thank you. I'm glad you're our Lesser Prairie-Chicken guy, because that's that kind of technical stuff I don't understand, but you in the service understand how that works. So thanks, Kent. Appreciate that. Another question we have, Chanda mentioned how our plan is to enroll new lands for existing oil and gas participants. And so that's going to be in place here in the next few weeks, as Chanda mentioned. But this other question, I think, gets to the question of, will we be allowing new participants to come into the program? And so we've had a lot of discussion about this. I know we've gotten input from the directors from the 20 WAFWA states and the Canadian provinces and territories. And we've gotten feedback from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on this. So Chris, I might ask you to sum that up, our perspective, our thoughts on the potential in the time we have before the listing is finally decided on, what our thoughts are about enrolling new participants from oil and gas.
So, thanks, Brad. So in the plan that was approved in July, we do contemplate what it would mean to open up the CCAA to new businesses, new enrollees. And we basically say that right now, even though it's in the plan and there's a way to do it, we're considering it, but we're not doing it at this point in time. And we will, as time goes on, over the rest of the fall, consider what that means, have continuing discussions. But right now, we don't have the bandwidth to really deal with an influx of a large number of new participants. Bottom line, we don't have the staff, we don't have the resources to deal with that. However, again, it's still an open question. It hasn't been totally shut down yet. And that's something that the LPCIC will be talking about this week, this week when we meet again on Thursday. And certainly we'll have future conversations about it as well. But right now it's not open to new participants.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Chris. So a question that kind of dovetails with that one is, and I don't know who's going to answer this. I think I know what the answer is, but I'm not really qualified to answer it. The question is, if you're enrolled in New Mexico through their CCAA with oil and gas, are you considered an existing participant by WAFWA? So Ben, I see you shaking your head, and can't you two got to jump on that, would you?
No, those are two entirely separate agreements. They've nothing. They just don't share anything in common, but the fact that they're under the ESA, but that's it.
Okay, good. Well, we're down to our last couple minutes of this, and I'm looking if there's another quick question that we can get to squeeze in. So here's a question for Ben or Kent. How do you imagine debits working if the two populations wind up being split between the endangered population south and the threatened population up north?
So it doesn't matter. That's the beauty of a CCAA, is that it insulates the participant from the result of a listing. So that's the first thing. Listing or no listing, the CCAA stands the way it is. Then the second part of the answer is that it is already separated by ecoregion. So we can already tell you exactly how many impacts and how much mitigation was provided, but for the southern distinct population segment. But that would not be required anyway, because again, the CCA insulates participants from the land that they've enrolled in the CCA from the impact of the listing.
Good answer. So we are about out of time. So Zach Lowe, Zach is, like I said, our new executive director, taken over brand new, but Zach has a big picture perspective on how we're heading forward. And Zach, do you have some thoughts you want to conclude us with to give people a perspective on how we plan to move forward from WAFWA's perspective in managing this program? Zach, are you with me?
I am Brad. I'm here. Sorry, my video has frozen up. But yeah, I just think it's important for everybody to know as we contemplate these questions that we'll continue to move forward with transparency, sound investments, and efficient business operations that serve Lesser Prairie-Chicken at hand we all have.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thanks, Zach. Yeah, it's, for some of you, the audio have been a little tough there, but yeah, all the principles that we're talking about that Zach just outlined, transparency, sound investments, business operations, but all with the goal of serving Lesser Prairie-Chicken conservation. That's what we're about. And that's what, when Kansas starts to drift, Oklahoma or Texas, Colorado, New Mexico pulls us back in. So we're all working toward that goal of Lesser Prairie-Chicken conservation. This has been a complex effort, started back years ago. We're currently building on that foundation, and we feel like we're in a stronger position than we've ever been, right? Which is the way good businesses are. So we really feel confident that we're moving ahead. As I promised earlier, we will address in the next couple of days, once we get through all of the questions, we'll answer those. Those will be included, attached to our information on the website, along with the recording of this 2-hour seminar. So again, thank you all for your participation. We are enthused about where we're headed, and we appreciate your help in helping us get to a better place and conserve these precious birds. So thank you all very much, and we will say so long.